You know, it's fascinating how some figures in history become almost inseparable from the very idea of the nation they helped create.
Yeah, absolutely. They become these symbols, don't they?
Right, you think of George Washington and the United States, or maybe Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam's path to independence. It's like their personal story is just woven right into the fabric of the country.
Hmm. These individuals often end up embodying the spirit of the struggle, the key ideals, the collective hopes that define a nation's birth.
And in India, that figure, so often revered as the father of the Indian nation, is of course Mahatma Gandhi.
Understandably so, given his immense influence.
And while that title is definitely understandable, as we always try to do on the deep dive, we want to peel back the layers a bit, right? Because even these towering historical figures like Gandhi, well, as much as they shape their times, they're also profoundly shaped by them.
Exactly. History isn't just following them, it's molding them too. It's a two-way street.
So that's really the core mission for this deep dive, and for you listening today. We've got this stack of sources, historical accounts, original documents, personal letters, even secret government reports and newspaper
A
clippings.
real mix of perspectives.
Yeah, and we're going to try and extract the most important bits of knowledge, the surprising facts, maybe some unexpected angles, to really get a handle on Mahatma Gandhi's activities and his, well, massive influence in India during that absolutely crucial period between 1915 and 1948.
We'll be looking at his impact, how he dealt with, the incredibly diverse sections of Indian society, and the popular struggles he inspired and led.
Think of this as a targeted deep dive specifically for you, kind of a shortcut to being genuinely well informed about this pivotal figure and this whole era. We're hunting for those aha moments you might miss in the standard narratives.
It was a period of just seismic transformation for India and for the nationalist movement. And Gandhi is undeniably at the center of it, but, sometimes in ways that are more complex, more nuanced than the simplified stories might suggest.
Okay, so let's start at a key turning point. His return to India. Where do we begin?
Well, he arrives back in India in January 1915. He's been out of the country for 2 decades, a huge chunk of his adult life, mainly in South Africa.
Right. 20 years is a long time to be away.
And that time in South Africa, as historians like Chandra Devanazan have pointed out, was really the making of the Mahatma. It wasn't just a side trip. It was where he forged the core tools and principles he'd later bring back to India.
How so? What was so formative about South Africa?
Well, it was there, facing all that intense racial discrimination and injustice against the Indian community, that he developed and really honed Satyagraha.
His philosophy of nonviolent resistance.
Exactly. It's often translated as truth force or soul force. It was his unique technique, a weapon forged not from violence, but from, well, truth and moral conviction.
It wasn't just a tactic, it was deeper than that. A moral thing.
Oh, absolutely. It was a way of fighting injustice that aimed to convert the opponent through moral persuasion and, crucially, self-suffering, rather than crushing them through violence. He also worked hard in South Africa to promote harmony between different religious groups within the Indian community there. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians.
Interesting. So even then, he was dealing with interfaith issues.
Yes. And importantly, he also started challenging the discriminatory attitudes within the Indian community itself, particularly the prejudices of upper caste Indians towards lower castes and towards women. He wasn't just fighting the external power, he was looking inward, too, at social evils within his own community.
Okay, so he steps off the boat in 1915, not just as a lawyer coming home, but as someone who's already led movements, tried out this new kind of protest, and grappled with these tough social issues. What kind of India did he actually find when he got back?
Well, the India he returned to in 1915 was still very much a British colony, the jewel in the crown and all that, but it was politically much more active, more galvanized than the one he'd left back in 1893.
How had it changed?
The Indian National Congress, which was founded way back in 1885, had really expanded its reach and influence. It had set up branches in most major cities and towns, and its base had grown, particularly among the educated middle classes. This growth was boosted by things like the agitations against the partition of Bengal around 1905-07, the Swadeshi movement.
And there was already a pretty developed political scene, right? Different factions, different leaders.
Definitely, you had a spectrum. On one end, there were the more militant nationalists, often called the extremists. People probably know the famous trio Lal Bal Pal, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandrapal. They pushed for more assertive, confrontational methods against the British.
Okay, the extremists. And on the other side?
On the other end were the moderates. They favored a more gradual constitutional path. They believed in things like petitioning, negotiation, working within the system to achieve reforms.
And who were the key figures there?
Gopal Krishna Gokhale was a major moderate leader, and significantly, he was also Gandhi's acknowledged political guru, his mentor. And interestingly, another prominent moderate around this time was Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Jinnah. Really? He was a moderate then?
Yes, a brilliant lawyer, trained in London, just like Gandhi. It just shows the different routes people took towards nationalism back then.
Wow. So Gandhi steps into this already complex, existing political landscape, and didn't Gokhale give him some advice right at the start? Like, don't just jump in.
Exactly. Gokhale very wisely told him to spend a year just traveling across British India, observing, listening, really understanding the country, its people, its problems, before getting involved politically. It was a year of quiet but intense learning.
And after that year of travel, his first big public moment was at the opening of Benares Hindu University, BHU, in 1916.
Yes, February 1916. That was his first major public appearance after his year of study.
Let's picture that scene. Who was actually there?
Gandhi himself described it as a most gorgeous show. It was very much a gathering of the Indian elite and the colonial establishment. You had princes from the princely states, wealthy philanthropists who'd funded the university, big names from the Congress like Annie Besant, plus British officials.
A very elite crowd. And Gandhi, was he well known amongst them?
He was known for his work in South Africa, but compared to many others there, he was still relatively new on the Indian scene, less prominent than the established leaders and dignitaries.
And then his speech. It wasn't exactly the standard congratulatory address, was it?
Oh, far from it. He used his high-profile platform not to praise the university or the VIPs, but to deliver this really stinging critique of the very people sitting right in front of him.
What was his main point?
His central charge was the Indian elite's detachment, their lack of real concern for the laboring poor, the vast majority of the Indian population. He pointed out the stark, almost offensive contrast between the richly bedecked noblemen in the audience, dripping with jewels, and the millions of poor Indians who were completely absent from this picture of supposed national progress.
And he was blunt about it. The sources quote him telling these powerful people, "There is no salvation for India unless you strip yourself of this jewelry and hold it in trust for your countrymen." That's incredibly direct.
And he went further. He explicitly linked the abstract idea of self-government, Swaraj, to the concrete reality of the poor farmer's life. He said, there can be no spirit of self-government about us. If we take away or allow others to take away from the peasants almost the whole of the results of their labor.
Wow.
And then a punchline. Our salvation can only come through the farmer. Neither the lawyers nor the doctors nor the rich landlords are going to secure it.
That must have landed like a bomb in that room. It completely shifts the focus of nationalism away from the elites, doesn't it? Puts the peasant front and center.
It was incredibly significant. It did two things at once. First, it was a statement of fact. He was acknowledging that, yes, Indian nationalism was mostly an elite thing at that point, run by professionals and landowners. But second, and more importantly, it was his public declaration of intent.
What intent?
Gandhi was basically announcing his mission. He was going to radically transform Indian nationalism. He wanted to make it truly representative of all Indians, especially the impoverished millions, and put their concerns right at the heart of the struggle for Swaraj.
Okay, so powerful statement. Did he immediately launch a big nationwide movement based on this?
Not right away on a national scale. He first started putting these ideas into practice through a series of more localized campaigns of the following years, 1917, 1918. He'd actually been approached by a peasant back at the Congress meeting in Lucknow in December 1916.
Right, the one who told him about Champaran.
Exactly. This peasant told him about the really harsh treatment of indigo cultivators in Champaran, in Bihar, by the British planters there.
And that became his first big campaign in India.
Yes. He spent a good chunk of 1917 in Champaran, organizing the peasants, investigating what was going on, and eventually helping them get better terms, things like security of tenure and the freedom to choose which crops they grew, instead of being forced into indigo.
And then he took on other local issues.
Yes, in 1918, he got involved in two more causes back in his home state of Gujarat.
The textile mill workers in Ahmedabad.
Right. He intervened in a labor dispute there, supporting the workers' demands for better conditions and wages. He actually used fasting as a tactic for the first time in India during that dispute.
And the Kheda peasants?
Yes, also in 1918. He joined peasants in Kheda district, who were really struggling after their harvest failed, and were asking the colonial government to let them off paying taxes for that year.
So these local campaigns, Champaran, Ahmedabad, Kheda, why were they so important?
Well, they were like laboratory experiments for his methods in the Indian context. They let him connect directly with different groups of poor people, rural peasants, urban workers, and crucially, they established him in the public eye and among other nationalist leaders as a different kind of leader,
How so?
as someone with deep practical sympathy for the poor, someone willing to actually go and live among them and act on their behalf, not just talk about them from afar. They were localized, sure, but they built his reputation and showed the potential power of his approach, his Satyagraha.
Okay, so these campaigns establish him, make him a significant figure. But what was the event, the catalyst that really pushed him onto the national stage, made him a leader recognized across the whole country?
That opportunity, kind of ironically, came directly from the British government itself. After World War I, which India had contributed a lot to, soldiers, resources.
There was an expectation of reforms, right? More free.
Exactly. But instead, the British government, based on recommendations from something called the Rowlatt Committee, decided in 1919 to keep some of the really repressive wartime measures going. Things like censorship, detention without trial.
Extending wartime powers into peacetime, that wouldn't have gone down well.
Not at all. To many Indians, it felt like a betrayal. And for Gandhi, it was a clear injustice that needed a response. So unlike the usual moderate approach or fragmented protests, Gandhi called for a countrywide campaign against this Rowlatt Act, a nationwide satyagraha.
A nonviolent civil disobedience campaign across India. How did people respond?
The response was massive, unprecedented. Towns across North and West India just shut down. Shops closed, schools emptied, businesses stopped as people answered Gandhi's call for a general strike. The protests were particularly intense in Punjab.
Why Punjab specifically?
Well, the sources suggest Punjab felt particularly aggrieved. Many Punjabi men had fought and died for the British in the war. They expected some kind of reward, recognition. Instead, they got the Rowlatt Act. Plus, tensions were already high because the British had detained Gandhi when he tried to go to Punjab, and they'd arrested prominent local leaders in Amritsar.
Which all tragically led up to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
Yes, April 13th, 1919. In Amritsar, thousands had gathered peacefully in this enclosed garden, Jallianwala Bagh, despite a ban on meetings. Brigadier General Dyer ordered his troops to block the only exit and fired directly into the unarmed crowd.
It was horrific. Hundreds killed.
Official counts said over 400. Nationalist estimates were much higher. A truly brutal act of colonial violence.
And that terrible event, combined with the huge scale of the protests against the Rowlatt Act everywhere else, that really cemented Gandhi's position, didn't it? As a national leader who could mobilize people like never before.
It absolutely did. He became the focal point of national anger and resistance. Emboldened by this and galvanized by the outrage over Jallianwala Bagh, Gandhi then called for an even bigger, more ambitious movement, the non-cooperation movement.
Non-cooperation. What was the core idea there?
It was simple, but revolutionary, really. The idea was that British rule in India only survived because Indians cooperated with it. If Indians voluntarily withdrew that cooperation, the whole structure, the Raj, would collapse.
So what did that mean in practice? What were people asked to do?
It was pretty wide-ranging. Students were told to leave government schools and colleges. Lawyers were asked to boycott British courts. People were urged not to pay taxes. The call was for the renunciation of all voluntary association with the British government, total withdrawal.
And he attached this huge promise to it, didn't he? Swaraj, self-rule, within a year if everyone did it.
A very powerful, motivating promise. And to broaden the movement's base even more, and crucially to try and build Hindu-Muslim unity against the British, Gandhi made a strategic alliance with the leaders of the Khilafat movement.
Right, the Khilafat movement. Can you remind us what that was about?
Sure. This was a movement that grew among Indian Muslims after World War I. The Ottoman Empire, whose sultan was also the caliph, the spiritual and political head for many Muslims worldwide, had been defeated. The Khilafat leaders in India, particularly the Ali brothers, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, were protesting the harsh treaty terms imposed on the Ottoman Empire. They felt it undermined the caliph's authority, especially over Muslim holy places.
So Indian Muslims were concerned about the caliphate, way over in Turkey.
Yes, it was a pan-Islamist issue that really resonated with many Muslims in India. Gandhi saw this as a perfect opportunity to unite Hindus and Muslims in a common fight against the British. He supported the Caliphate demands and urged Hindus to join the non-cooperation movement alongside their Muslim neighbors.
And this combination, the call for non-cooperation and the alliance with Caliphate, really unleashed something powerful, a surge of popular action, as the source puts it.
It really did. The scale and diversity of participation were unlike anything seen before. It wasn't just political elites or specific regions. Students and lawyers did leave government institutions in large numbers. The working class hit hard with strikes. The figures from 1921 are staggering. Nearly 400 strikes, 600,000 workers involved, 7 million workdays lost. That's major disruption.
And it wasn't just in the cities, it spread to the countryside, too.
Oh, absolutely. The spirit of defiance spread right across rural India. You had hill tribes in northern Andhra openly defying colonial forest laws that restricted their traditional rights. Peasants in Wad and UP refusing to pay taxes. Down in Kumaon, peasants refused to do bigar, that forced labor of carrying luggage for colonial officials.
And this is where the sources show it wasn't always perfectly controlled from the top down, right?
That's a really crucial insight. While Gandhi and the Congress leadership issued the calls, people on the ground, peasants, workers often interpreted non-cooperate and the promise of Swaraj in ways that addressed their own immediate grievances against landlords, moneylenders, specific local officials, not just the abstract goal of ending British rule.
So they used the movement to fight their own local battles.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
And occasionally, these local actions went beyond or even directly against the specific instructions from the national or provincial leaders. The movement became this huge umbrella under which all sorts of existing local discontents could be expressed.
The American biographer Louis Fisher's description captures it well, doesn't it?
It really does. He wrote that non-cooperation became the name of an epoch. Negative enough to be peaceful, but positive enough to be effective. It entailed denial, renunciation, and self-discipline. It was training for self-rule.
Training for self-rule? I like that. It suggests it wasn't just about getting rid of the British, but also about building something new, building capacity among Indians. This movement must have seriously shaken the British Raj.
Absolutely. More than anything since maybe the 1857 revolt. The sheer scale of mass participation was something they hadn't really faced before. But then, quite dramatically, the movement was called off in February 1922.
Because of what happened at Chauri Chaura?
Exactly. In this village, Chauri Chaura in Uttar Pradesh, a nationalist procession was fired on by the police. In response, an enraged group of peasants attacked and burned down the police station, killing several policemen inside.
And even though they were provoked, Gandhi saw this violence as completely unacceptable, a violation of Satyagraha.
Totally. He was deeply disturbed. He felt the country wasn't ready for a truly non-violent mass struggle if things like this could happen. He believed the violence showed the movement had lost its moral compass and could just descend into chaos, so he called the whole thing off.
Just stopped it. That must have been controversial.
Extremely. Many nationalist leaders were very disappointed. They felt the movement was reaching its peak. But for Gandhi, the commitment to nonviolence was absolute, non-negotiable. He said, no provocation can possibly justify the brutal murder of men who had been rendered defenseless.
And then, soon after he called off the movement, the British arrested him.
Yes, in March 1922. He was charged with sedition because of articles he'd written in his journal, Young India.
And his trial was quite something, wasn't it, the judge's remarks?
Yes, Justice C.N. Broomfield. He gave this really remarkable speech when sentencing Gandhi.
What did he say? What was so remarkable?
Well, Justice Broomfield openly acknowledged Gandhi's unique status. He said, it would be impossible to ignore the fact that you are in a different category from any person I have ever tried or am likely to try. He recognized Gandhi's huge moral authority and popularity, saying in the eyes of millions of your countrymen, you are a great patriot and a leader.
Wow. He even called him saintly.
He did. He said, even those who differ from you in politics look upon you as a man of high ideals and of even saintly life. This is the colonial judge sentencing him for trying to overthrow the government.
That's extraordinary.
It really is. Broomfield explained he had to sentence him 6 years because Gandhi had deliberately broken the law. But he finished by saying something like, if events in India allowed the government to reduce the sentence and release him, no one will be better pleased than I.
It shows how complex the situation was, even for the British. They had to jail him, but they knew who they were dealing with.
Exactly. They knew they weren't just dealing with the standard political agitator. They recognized his unique moral force, his legitimacy in the eyes of millions.
So by the time he goes to prison in 1922, Gandhi has already fundamentally changed Indian nationalism.
He absolutely had. He delivered on that promise from his 1916 BHU speech. Nationalism wasn't just an elite affair anymore. It was a mass movement involving hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, peasants, workers, artisans, students, people who'd previously been on the margins of politics.
And a lot of that transformation came down to how he connected with ordinary people, right?
Absolutely. Many people, especially in the countryside, started to really venerate him. They called him Mahatma Great Soul. And this wasn't just about politics. It was deeply connected to his lifestyle choices, his apparent identification with their struggles.
Like his clothing, the simple dhoti.
Exactly. He deliberately chose to dress like the poorest Indians in just a simple dhoti or loincloth. That stood in such stark contrast to the Western suits or formal Indian clothes worn by most other nationalist leaders.
That visual symbol must have been incredibly powerful.
Tremendously powerful. The source mentions how, during a tour in South India in 1921, he shaved his head and adopted the loincloth, specifically as a public act of identification with the poor. It wasn't just about clothes. It was a rejection of materialism, a symbol of asceticism, and a quiet critique of modern consumerism, which he felt was harmful. By shedding the symbols of his own class, he visually bridged that huge gap between the elite and the masses.
And then there's the charkha, the spinning wheel. That became almost the logo of the movement.
The charkha was absolutely central to his vision of Swaraj. It represented so many things at once. On a practical level, promoting hand spinning and weaving khadi was about economic self-reliance for India, breaking dependence on British textiles, providing extra income for the rural poor. But it was much, much more than just economics.
What else did it symbolize?
Gandhi himself spun every single day, and he encouraged everyone, lawyers, doctors, merchants, students, everyone to do the same. This act was profoundly symbolic. It was an attempt to break down the traditional caste barrier between mental labor, seen as superior, and manual labor, often looked down upon. By making spinning a form of manual work, a respected central activity for all nationalists, he was subtly challenging deep-seated social hierarchies. Dignity of labor.
And his views on machinery, mentioned in Young India, they're interesting, not just a blanket rejection of all technology.
No, it's more nuanced than that. He was certainly critical of what he called the craze for machinery as it existed in the West. He saw how it could enslave humans, displace workers, concentrate wealth and power. But he wasn't against technology itself. He wrote he wanted to save time and labor, but not for a fraction of mankind, but for all.
So technology should serve everyone, especially the poor.
That was his point. And he saw the Chircon as exactly that kind of appropriate technology. He called it an exquisite piece of machinery used for the service of the poorest in their own cottages. So his issue wasn't with machines per se, but with how they were used where they serve humanity, especially the vulnerable, or exploiting them. It was a very human-centered view of technology.
This focus on the common person, the simple lifestyle, the symbols, it clearly struck a deep chord. The sources, like Shahid Amin's study, show how this connection sometimes turned into something almost mythical in popular perception.
Ah, yes, this is where it gets really fascinating. Amin studied how peasants in eastern UP in the 1920s saw Gandhi, based on local reports and, crucially, rumors that were circulating. When Gandhi toured there in 1921, the popular reaction was immense, almost ecstatic. Local newspapers recorded widespread rumors about his miraculous powers.
Miraculous powers? Seriously? Like, what?
Well, there were stories like one about a man named Sikandar Sahu, who supposedly said he'd only believe in Mahatmaji if his pan of boiling sugarcane juice split in two, and apparently it immediately did. Another story claimed a skeptical farmer's wheat field turned into a different crop overnight.
Wow. Those are pretty wild.
And the atmosphere at his meetings was apparently electric. Sources describe huge crowds, tens of thousands gathering even in remote places, people openly weeping, spontaneously showering him with money. One report from Gorakhpur describes people throwing currency notes and coins onto a spreadsheet. It was a sight.
So people didn't just see him as a political leader. He was seen as something more, a saint, maybe even divine.
That's what these rumors suggest. Peasants often saw him as a kind of savior figure who could rescue them from their immediate problems. High taxes, oppressive officials, abusive landlords. Rumors spread that he was sent by the king to fix their grievances, or even that his power was greater than the British king's, suggesting he could somehow magically make colonial rule vanish.
And there were even rumors about bad things happening to people who opposed him.
Yes, stories circulated that if you criticized Gandhi or ignored his message, your house might collapse, or your crops would fail, or your animals would die. Even tales of brickbats raining down on non-believers until they chanted Gandhi's name.
So what do these rumors tell us, not just about Gandhi, but about the people telling the stories?
That's the key question, isn't it? These stories are profoundly revealing about the hopes, the anxieties, the worldview of the peasantry. They weren't necessarily lies, but powerful expressions of hope born out of deep suffering and powerlessness. People projected their own desires for justice, for relief, for dignity onto this figure who seemed so pure, so simple, yet so powerful, seemingly more powerful than the colonial state. His lifestyle, his symbols, they resonated deeply and reinforced this image of someone almost supernatural, capable of achieving the impossible. It shows how people create narratives around leaders that empower themselves and articulate their deepest wishes.
That's a crucial point, how popular belief actively shapes the historical figure. But this incredible mass appeal, while partly spontaneous and based on perception, it wasn't just magic, was it? The sources also point to careful organization.
Oh, absolutely. The broadening of nationalism wasn't purely mystical. It was also the result of deliberate, careful organizational work by the Congress Party, guided by Gandhi's influence. New Congress branches were set up all over British India. They also worked to establish Prajamantals, people's associations in the princely states, areas not directly under British rule, to extend the nationalist message there, too.
And the shift towards using local languages.
A vital step. The provincial Congress committees were reorganized based on linguistic regions reflecting how people actually spoke, rather than the artificial administrative boundaries the British had created. This structural change was key to taking the nationalist message into the villages, into the farthest corners, and bringing in social groups who'd been left out when politics was mostly conducted in English in the cities.
And Gandhi also managed to get support from some maybe surprising sections of society, like wealthy businessmen.
Yes, that's another interesting layer. Some prominent Indian industrialists and businessmen, like G.D. Birla, provided financial backing to the Congress and sort of tacitly supported the nationalist cause.
Why would they do that? Their interests seemed different from the peasants.
Often it was quite pragmatic. They could see that an independent India would likely mean the end of the competitive advantages British businesses enjoyed under colonial rule. It would open up the Indian market for Indian industry. So you get this complex picture. Poor peasants venerating Gandhi as a savior, and rich industrialists supporting him for potentially very different, perhaps even conflicting economic reasons. Both saw something for themselves in the movement he led.
And Gandhi wasn't doing all this alone. He attracted a really impressive group of followers, didn't he?
Absolutely crucial. The success of Gandhian nationalism really depended on this core group of incredibly talented leaders who gathered around him from about 1917 onwards. People like Mahatma Gandhi, his devoted secretary, Vallabhbhai Patel, the organizational powerhouse from Gujarat, J.B. Kripalani, Subhash Chandra Bose, the dynamic leader from Bengal, Abul Kalam Azad, a leading Muslim scholar and nationalist, Jawaharlal Nehru, the intellectual voice, Sarojini Naidu, the poet and orator, Govind Ballabh Pant, C. Rajagopalachari from the South. A real who's who of the independence movement.
Exactly. They came from different regions, different backgrounds, different religious traditions, and they in turn inspired countless others down the line, at the local level, to join the struggle.
So after his release from prison in 1924, having transformed the movement, what did Gandhi focus on? Did he jump back into leading political campaigns?
Actually, no. After his early release in 1924, he largely stepped back from the day-to-day political negotiations of the Congress. He focused instead on what he called the constructive program.
Meaning social reform.
Primarily, yes. His top priorities were promoting khadi, hand-spun and hand-woven cloth, and the campaign to abolish untouchability. He fundamentally believed that India couldn't be truly free, or even worthy of freedom, until it cleansed itself of deep-rooted social evils like child marriage, and especially the terrible prejudice and discrimination against untouchables.
So for him, social reform and political independence were two sides of the same coin. Exactly. Swaraj wasn't just about kicking the British out. It was about achieving self-rule at a much deeper societal level, overcoming internal divisions, achieving self-reliance through things like Kheda, fostering genuine tolerance between faiths. He poured enormous energy into this constructive work after 1924.
But he did eventually re-enter the political fray more directly later in the
He
1920s.
did, around 1928. He gave his blessing and support to some significant campaigns that were happening then. There were the big all-India protests against the Simon Commission, that all-white commission sent from London to decide India's future with no Indian input. And he also helped guide a major peasant satyagraha in Bardoli that year.
And this return leads up to a really crucial moment at the Lahore Congress session in December 1929.
A landmark session, absolutely. Two massive decisions came out of Lahore. First, Jawaharlal Nehru, who really represented the younger, more radical wing of the nationalists, was elected president of the Congress. That signaled a shift. Second, the Congress formally declared Purna Swaraj, complete independence, as its goal. No more talk of dominion status within the empire. This was it. Full freedom.
That's a major step up in demands, and it led to the Declaration of Independence Day.
Yes, they designated January 26, 1930 as the first Independence Day. The Congress organized nationwide observances. People hoisted the nationalist flag, sang patriotic songs. Gandhi gave really specific instructions on how the day should be marked, ideally at the exact same time in villages and cities, announced by traditional drums. But the day wasn't just for celebration. It was meant for constructive work.
Like what?
Spinning, service to untouchables, working for Hindu-Muslim unity, promoting prohibition. And everyone was asked to take a pledge.
A pledge for independence.
Yes, a powerful pledge affirming the inalienable right of the Indian people to have freedom and to enjoy the fruits of their toil, and stating that if any government denies these rights, the people have the right to alter it or abolish it. Strong stuff.
And it was shortly after this first Independence Day that Gandhi announced his next big move, the Salt Satyagraha. This seems like a stroke of genius politically.
It's widely seen as one of his most brilliant tactical decisions. He announced he would lead a march to the seacoast to deliberately break the British law that gave the state a monopoly on making and selling salt.
Why salt? Of all things, it seems so ordinary.
That was precisely the genius of it. Salt was something every single household in India needed every day, regardless of religion, caste, or wealth. But the British government banned Indians from making their own salt, even from the natural salt deposits found along the coast. They forced everyone to buy heavily taxed salt from government depots.
So it affected literally everyone, especially the poor.
Exactly. The monopoly and the tax were deeply unpopular. By targeting the salt law, Gandhi chose an issue that touched the lives of every Indian, unifying them against a common grievance. He framed it as a fundamental injustice.
And the sources show how powerfully he argued against it, calling it a wicked salt tax.
He really laid it out. He pointed out the absurdity of the government destroying natural salt just because they couldn't sell it profitably, while taxing this vital necessity. He called it a fourfold curse. It destroyed a village industry. It was wanton destruction of nature's bounty. It cost money to do the destroying, and it imposed this ridiculously high tax, over 1,000%, he claimed, on starving people. He argued it only existed because people were passive, and it had to be abolished through people's own strength.
And he even told the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, what he was planning to do, gave him advance notice.
He did. He wrote to Irwin explaining his intentions. But it seems the British, even after non-cooperation, still didn't fully grasp the potential symbolic power of this seemingly simple act of defiance. They underestimated it.
So the march begins March 12th, 1930.
Yes. Gandhi starts walking from his ashram at Sabarmati, heading towards the coastal village of Dandi with a select group of followers.
It wasn't a short walk.
No, it took 3 weeks. About 240 miles, walking roughly 10 miles a day. Along the way, he stopped in villages, addressed crowds, spread his message of Swaraj and Satyagraha. When he finally reached Dandi on April 6th,
He just picked up some salt.
he walked down to the shore and picked up a lump of natural salt left by the waves. A simple act, but by doing so, he symbolically broke the British salt law and made himself a criminal in the eyes of the state.
And that simple act lit a fire across the country.
Precisely as he intended. His action at Dandi was the signal. All across India, people started making salt illegally, defying the law. And just like with non-cooperation, the call for civil disobedience around salt became a catalyst for expressing all sorts of other grievances against the colonial state.
So other forms of protest started up too.
Yes. Peasants started breaking forest laws again. Factory workers went on strike. Lawyers boycotted the courts. Students left government schools. People used the momentum of the Salt Satyagraha to push back against colonial authority in ways that made sense in their local context.
How did the British react this time? Did they arrest people immediately?
They responded with mass arrests, yes. In the weeks and months following the start of the Salt Satyagraha and the widespread defiance, huge numbers of Indians were arrested. The sources estimate nearly 60,000, including Gandhi himself, who was arrested about a month after reaching Dandi.
And those secret police reports you mentioned earlier, they must give us a fascinating window into how the British saw this unfolding.
They really do. These Home Department fortnightly reports are invaluable for seeing it from the inside, from the colonial administration's point of view. They show their perspective, their worries, their anxieties, and often, frankly, their inability to really get what was going on.
And the reports about the Salt March itself, Source 8 you mentioned, they start off sounding quite dismissive.
Oh, absolutely. In the early reports, March 1930, as the march is just starting, they're clearly trying to downplay it. They call it theatrical, say his program is impracticable. They claim people have little or no interest, they're busy with exams or the harvest, they're happy under the Raj. One report from Bengal talks about little enthusiasm for Gandhi's type of civil disobedience. It really feels like they're trying to convince themselves it's nothing to worry about.
But even in those early reports, you see cracks in that story, contradictions.
Exactly. Despite the dismissive tone, the reports contain details that undermine their own narrative. A report from the Central Provinces mentions a meeting to celebrate the start of the march was attended by over 3,000 people. The Madras report admits that even if officials think it's theatrical, Gandhi himself is held in such personal reverence that the idea of arresting him causes considerable misgiving. They also make a point of noting that ladies are attending meetings in increasing numbers.
The fact they mentioned ladies specifically suggests that was unusual, maybe worrying for them.
It certainly suggests the movement was reaching beyond the usual political activists, pulling in different segments of society. And as the march goes on through March, you see the turn in the reports start to shift. They detail volunteers signing up, propaganda reaching villages, preparations being made across provinces to break the salt laws. Bihar and Orissa report talk of refusing the Chowkidari tax. Punjab is bracing for trouble.
And that quote from the Deputy Superintendent of Police observing Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi appeared calm and collected. He is gathering more strength as he proceeds. That directly contradicts the early dismissal.
It does. And it's coming from someone seeing it firsthand. The police spies were also reporting his speeches, showing how he was directly appealing to villagers, even calling on local officials to resign and join the cause. In places like Wasna, he wasn't just talking politics. He was tackling social issues head-on, telling upper castes they had to serve untouchables if they wanted Swaraj, stressing Hindu-Muslim Parsi-Sikh unity. The reports noted his meetings were, quote, very well attended by villagers of all castes and by women as well as men. Thousands were volunteering, officials were resigning. The initial spin wasn't holding up to reality.
So why the initial attempt to downplay it in the official reports? What was going on there?
Well, the source analysis suggests a couple of things. Maybe officials were trying to reassure themselves and London that everything was under control, or maybe they just genuinely couldn't comprehend a mass movement based on nonviolence and moral force. They were used to dealing with armed uprisings or elite petitions. This was something different, and they struggled to fit it into their usual framework of law and order problems.
And all the reporting about the possibility of arresting Gandhi, what does that tell us?
That reveals their deep anxiety. As Gandhi himself suggested in a speech just before reaching Dandi, he thought the government hesitated to arrest him, partly out of fear of world opinion, and partly because they were maybe ashamed to arrest such an army of peaceful protesters. The police reports constantly asking about public reaction if he were arrested show they knew it was a massive risk. Arresting him could be the spark that ignited the inflammable material they saw everywhere. They were clearly caught between letting him continue and risking a huge backlash if they arrested him.
It's fascinating to see the state grappling with something it couldn't control or really understand. And this wasn't just the British government in India. Even the international press, like Time magazine, had to adjust its view, right?
Oh, definitely. Time's initial coverage was incredibly dismissive, almost sneering. They focused on his physical appearance, spindly frame, spidery loins, and were deeply skeptical this emaciated saint could even survive the march. They even wrongly reported he'd collapsed early on. It really reflected a lot of prejudice and a total underestimation of him and the movement.
But that tone didn't last long.
Not at all. Within a week, as the march gained huge momentum and grabbed headlines worldwide, Time's tune changed completely. They started acknowledging the massive popular following he had. They noted the British rulers were now desperately anxious. They began calling him a saint and a statesman, even remarking rather pointedly that he was using Christian acts as a weapon against men with Christian beliefs.
That's quite a turnaround in just 1 week. From mocking to saluting him, it really shows the impact the march was having globally.
It absolutely highlights how successful the Salt March was. The sources really point to three key reasons why it was so significant. First, it undeniably put Gandhi and the Indian independence struggle on the world map. It got massive coverage in Europe and America, forcing people internationally to pay attention.
Second, and this is huge for the social history, it was the first big nationalist campaign where women participated in really large numbers.
Yes, this was a major breakthrough. Activists like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay were key here. She actually persuaded Gandhi, who initially had reservations about women facing the potential harshness of the salt raids, not to exclude women. She argued the salt tax hit women hard as homemakers, and their participation was vital. And women did participate massively, courting arrest by making salt or picketing liquor shops. Their visibility was a huge step forward.
And third, the Salt March forced the British to face a hard truth.
It forced them to realize, maybe truly for the first time, that their rule in India wasn't permanent. The scale of the defiance, the popular support, the global spotlight, it showed that holding India by force against this kind of nonviolent mass movement was becoming impossible. It really shifted the thinking within the British establishment, making them accept that they would eventually have to devolve power and seriously consider independence. The Salt March was pivotal in that psychological shift.
Okay, so this realization prompts new talks, the roundtable conferences in London in the early 30s.
Yes, the British government convened these conferences to discuss potential reforms. But the first one, in late 1930, was pretty much useless because Gandhi and most of the Congress leaders were still in jail from the Salt Satyagraha.
So they had to release him.
Pretty much. Gandhi was released in January 1931. In February, he had a series of long, direct meetings with the Viceroy, Lord Irwin. This led to the Gandhi-Irwin Pact.
What did they agree on in the pact?
Basically, Congress agreed to call off the civil disobedience movement. In return, the British agreed to release the political prisoners arrested during the movement and allow people on the coast to make salt for their own use.
But not independence.
No. And that was the criticism from more radical nationalists. Gandhi couldn't get a commitment on independence itself, only an agreement to talk more about future constitutional reforms.
So Gandhi then goes to the second roundtable conference in London later in 1931. But this is where things get complicated, right? With other groups challenging Congress's claim to represent everyone.
Exactly. This conference really highlighted the growing complexity, the multiple voices emerging in Indian politics. Gandhi and the Congress claimed they represented all of India, but that claim was strongly contested. The Muslim League under Jinnah argued it alone spoke for India's Muslim minority. The rulers of the princely states said Congress had no say in their territories, and critically, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Representing the depressed classes, the Dalits.
Yes. Ambedkar, a brilliant lawyer and leader, argued forcefully that Gandhi and the Congress, being dominated by upper castes, did not genuinely represent the interests of the lowest castes.
And this leads to that really fundamental clash between Ambedkar and Gandhi over political representation for Dalits.
A clash of fundamental principles. Ambedkar demanded separate electorates for the depressed classes. He believed this was absolutely essential for them to have a distinct political voice and power to protect themselves from upper caste dominance.
But Gandhi was fiercely opposed to separate electorates for them. The source quotes him saying it would ensure their bondage in perpetuity and perpetuate the stigma of untouchability.
He argued it would permanently segregate them from the rest of Hindu society, making integration impossible and undermining the fight against untouchability itself. He believed the goal had to be the complete destruction of untouchability, not measures that would solidify political separation. He asked basically, do you want them to stay untouchable forever?
But Ambedkar's counter-argument, based on the lived reality of caste oppression, was also incredibly powerful.
Devastatingly so. In his written response, quoted in the source, Ambedkar painted this stark picture. The depressed classes were economically powerless, treated like lepers by religion and society, completely dependent on high-caste Hindus who actively blocked any chance for their advancement.
And because of this total vulnerability,
Ambedkar argued they absolutely needed some share of political power in order that it may protect itself. He saw separate electorates not as segregation, but as a necessary shield, a vital tool for self-defense against what he saw as the organized tyranny of the majority Hindu society.
So this wasn't just a technical debate about voting systems. It was a deep disagreement about the nature of caste, the best path to equality, social reform versus political power.
A profound and, frankly, still relevant tension within the larger freedom struggle. Unsurprisingly, with these deep divisions, the Second Roundtable Conference achieved little. Gandhi returned to India, and civil disobedience resumed.
And the next viceroy, Lord Willingdon, seemed to have a pretty dim view of Gandhi.
Yet, his private letters, quoted in the source, show that classic colonial inability to get Gandhi. He wrote things like, "It's a beautiful world if it wasn't for Gandhi." He always suspected political motives, couldn't grasp the moral or spiritual dimension, saw Indians generally as unpractical, mystical, and superstitious folk who look upon Gandhi as something holy. It just highlights that huge gap in understanding.
Despite the stalemate, the British did eventually bring in some reforms with the Government of India Act of 1935.
Yes, that act promised a degree of representative government at the provincial level, establishing provincial autonomy and expanding the franchise, although it was still limited by property qualifications. Elections were held under this act in 1937.
And Congress did well.
Very well. They swept the general seats and formed governments in 8 out of the 11 provinces, a significant taste of political power.
But this period of provincial government didn't last long because of World War II starting in 1939.
Exactly. Britain declared India at war without consulting any Indian leaders. Gandhi and Nehru were personally anti-Nazi, but the Congress leadership said they'd only support the war effort if Britain guaranteed independence afterwards.
Which the British refused.
They did. The viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, said no dice on a firm promise of independence. So in protest, the Congress ministries resigned in October 1939. Over the next couple of years, Congress organized limited individual acts of satyagraha to keep the pressure on peacefully.
And this period sees the political landscape shift again, becoming more of a three-way contest?
Yes, it really solidifies into Congress versus the Muslim League versus the British. While Congress leaders were either holding back from mass action during the war or later ended up in jail, the Muslim League, under Jinnah, used the opportunity strategically to build its strength. And in March 1940, they passed the crucial Lahore Resolution.
Often seen as the first formal demand for Pakistan.
Widely interpreted that way, yes. It called for autonomy from Muslim-majority areas in the northwest and east, laying the groundwork for the future demand for a separate state.
And even within the British government, there wasn't total agreement on India.
No, you had the wartime coalition government in Britain with Labour members who were more sympathetic to India, but the dominant figure was Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a committed imperialist who was definitely not keen on letting India go.
But they did make one more attempt to find a compromise during the war, the Cripps Mission in 1942.
Yes, Sir Stafford Cripps, a Labour politician known to be friendly with Nehru, was sent out. The offer was basically Dominion status after the war, and crucially, it included a clause allowing provinces to opt out of a future Indian Union, a concession towards the League. But the talks failed.
Why did they fail?
Partly, the source suggests, because Congress insisted that if they were going to fully back the war effort, especially with the Japanese threatening invasion, that an Indian must be appointed as the defense member in the Viceroy's Executive Council. The British refused to give up control of defense during wartime.
And the failure of the Cripps Mission leads directly to Gandhi's final major movement, Quit India.
Yes. August 1942. Gandhi was frustrated, felt the British presence was just inviting Japanese attack, and believed the time had come for the British to leave immediately. He launched the Quit India campaign. The slogan was powerful and simple, but the British reaction was immediate and harsh. Gandhi and virtually the entire top Congress leadership were arrested almost instantly.
But like before, arresting the leaders didn't stop the movement itself.
Not at all. With the leadership gone, Quit India became this widespread, spontaneous, and often quite forceful popular uprising. Younger activists, particularly socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan, went underground, organizing strikes and sabotage. But even more striking were the parallel government.
Right, where people actually took over local administration. Tell us about Satara.
Yes, in places like Satara in Maharashtra and Medinipur in Bengal, nationalists essentially overthrew local British authority and set up their own Prati Sarkars, or parallel governments. In Satara, this went on for years. They had volunteer corps, village units, people's courts dispensing justice. They organized constructive work and had strong support from local peasants and Dalits. Despite intense British repression, they maintained a degree of local control right up until 1946.
That shows incredible grassroots mobilization and initiative.
It really does. It showed the spirit of resistance and self-governance had gone deep. Quit India was a massive upheaval, involving hundreds of thousands, especially energizing young people who left college to join and go to jail. But there was a crucial political consequence. Well, the Congress leaders were locked up.
The Muslim League gained ground.
Exactly. With Congress effectively silenced, Jinnah and the League worked hard to expand their influence and organization. They made significant inroads, especially in provinces like Punjab and Sindh, where they'd been weaker before. This period really strengthened their position as the primary voice for Muslim political aspirations.
So Quit India powerfully showed the Indian demand for freedom, but it also deepened the divisions that would lead to partition.
Undeniably. It widened that gulf between Congress and the League, making a united independent India look increasingly unlikely. When the war ended, Gandhi was released in June 1944. He tried immediately to bridge the gap, holding long talks with Jinnah later that year, but they couldn't find common ground.
And the political polarization just kept growing.
It did. The new Labour government came to power in Britain in 1945, genuinely committed to Indian independence. Viceroy Wavell tried to bring Congress and the League together, but failed. The 1946 provincial elections starkly showed the divide. Congress swept the general seats, the League won almost all the Muslim reserve seats. Jinnah's claim to represent Muslims now had clear electoral backing.
Making any agreement on unity almost impossible.
Extremely difficult. The cabinet mission in summer 1946 was the last real attempt to broker a deal for a united federal India with strong protections for minorities. But it also failed to get both sides to agree.
And after that failure, Jinnah called for Direct Action Day.
August 16, 1946. A call meant to demonstrate Muslim solidarity and press the demand for Pakistan. Tragically, it ignited horrific communal violence, starting with terrible riots in Calcutta that then spread like wildfire rural Bengal, Bihar, UP, Punjab. Unspeakable violence and suffering on all sides, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh.
So the final path to independence was overshadowed by this terrible violence.
Yes, the dream was turning into a nightmare for many. In February 1947, Lord Mountbatten arrived as the last viceroy, tasked with transferring power quickly. His final round of talks failed to find a way to keep India united. The decision was made. Freedom would come, but India would be divided. India and Pakistan.
August 15th, 1947, Independence Day, a day of massive celebration in Delhi and elsewhere. But Gandhi wasn't there.
No. He deliberately stayed away from the official celebrations in the capital. He was in Calcutta, one of the areas worst hit by the violence, observing a 24-hour fast.
Why? Why wasn't he celebrating the freedom he had fought for his whole life?
Because for him, freedom had come at what he called an unacceptable price. The division of the country, the horrific violence between Hindus and Muslims, it was the absolute antithesis of everything he stood for. Unity, nonviolence. While others cheered political freedom, he was mourning the human cost, the broken promise of a united India.
So in those final months of his life, his entire focus was on trying to stop the violence.
Completely. His biographer Tendulkar calls these last months Gandhi's finest hour. Through late 1947, amidst the carnage, he was right there in the worst affected areas, Calcutta, then Delhi, walking through riot-torn streets, visiting hospitals, refugee camps, trying to console people, desperately appealing to Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs to stop the killing, to forget the past, to find fellowship, to live in peace.
And he and Nehru also worked to ensure the rights of minorities in the new India.
Yes, even amidst the chaos, they push hard within the Congress leadership for a resolution affirming that independent India would be a democratic, secular state where all citizens enjoy full rights and are equally entitled to the protection of the state, irrespective of the religion to which they belong. A clear commitment against a Hindu-only state.
But even in Delhi, trying to preach peace, he faced hostility.
He did. At his daily prayer meetings, refugees who had suffered terribly in Pakistan would interrupt, objecting to readings from the Quran, shouting slogans, asking why he wasn't speaking about Hindu and Sikh suffering over there.
And Tendulkar's point in the source helps understand Gandhi's position on that.
Yes, Tendulkar notes Gandhi was absolutely equally concerned about minorities in Pakistan. But he felt his moral authority to appeal for peace there was compromised if he couldn't first guarantee safety and justice for Muslims in India's own capital. He basically felt, how could he go to Pakistan and ask for fair treatment for Hindus and Sikhs there when Muslims were being attacked in Delhi?
He even survived an assassination attempt just before his death.
Yes, a bomb attack during a prayer meeting on January 20th, 1948. But he carried on, undaunted, as the source says. Just days later, on January 26th, the day that used to be Independence Day, he spoke at his prayer meeting, acknowledging the disillusionment he felt, how the joy of freedom had been replaced by violence and division.
But he didn't give up hope.
No. He said he trusted the worst is over and hoped Indians would work for equality of all classes and creeds, stressing there should never be the domination and superiority of the major community over a minor. And even though India and Pakistan were now divided geographically, he hoped they could still be, at heart, friends and brothers, helping and respecting one another.
A final plea for the unity and tolerance he'd always fought for, even after partition made it impossible.
But, as we know, others were filled with hate and bitterness over partition. They couldn't forgive his efforts for peace, his insistence on protecting Muslims. On the evening of January 30, 1948, walking to his prayer meeting in Delhi, Mahatma Gandhi was shot and killed by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist extremist.
His death caused shockwaves around the world, an incredible outpouring of grief.
Tributes came from everyone, across the Indian political spectrum, even his opponents, and international figures like George Orwell, Albert Einstein, and Time magazine, which had once mocked him, now offered this somber comparison. Source 306.
Comparing him to Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, seeing a parallel. Both men killed by fanatics who couldn't accept their belief in equality. Lincoln on race, Gandhi on religious faith and community. Time wrote something like, "The world knew that it had, in a sense, too deep, too simple for the world to understand, connived at his death, as it had connived at Lincoln's." A powerful suggestion that the world's failure to fully embrace their messages contributed to their deaths.
A deeply somber end. So how do we, looking back now, try to understand this huge, complex figure and the movement he led? As we said at the start, the sources are absolutely everything.
They are. To piece together Gandhi's life, his politics, the whole nationalist movement, you have to engage with all sorts of sources. No single one gives you the full picture.
We have his own public voice, his writings, speeches.
Yes, his published works, articles in Young India, Harijan, countless speeches. They give us his philosophy, his political stances, his vision. But we can contrast that with what the source calls his private scripts, his letters.
Which might give a different, maybe more personal view.
They can offer glimpses of his private thoughts, his anger, pain, hopes, frustrations, things he might not show as openly in public. But, as the source points out, that public-private line can be blurry.
How so?
Well, many leaders, including Gandhi, knew their letters might eventually be published. Gandhi himself published letters he received in Harijan. Nehru published a bunch of old letters. So the awareness of a potential audience could shape even private writing. Conversely, fear of publication might make someone hold back their frankest thoughts.
And these letters can reveal so much about the internal politics. That Source 7 example, the Nehru Prasad Gandhi letters from the 1930s.
That's a fantastic case study. It really shows the tensions inside the Congress leadership. You see Nehru with his socialist ideas clashing with the more conservative wing people like Rajendra Prasad and Sardar Patel. It got so bad the conservatives threatened to resign from the working committee. Indian industrialists, who generally backed Gandhi but were nervous about Nehru's socialism, were also attacking Nehru.
And Gandhi's role was to mediate.
As usual, he stepped in, trying to hold it all together. The letters show him trying to moderate Nehru's radicalism a bit, while also convincing the conservatives and the industrialists that Nehru's leadership was essential. Reading that exchange gives you a really granular sense of the different ideologies clashing within Congress and Gandhi's unique role in navigating those conflicts.
Then there are autobiographies.
Yeah.
Hugely valuable, but need careful handling.
Exactly. Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth is obviously a classic. Autobiographies give you rich human detail, personal perspective. But you always have to remember they're written later, looking back. They're shaped by memory, by how the author sees themselves now, and by what they choose to include or exclude. It's always a constructed narrative, a framing of a picture.
So we need to pay attention to the gaps, the silences.
Definitely. Historians look for what's not said, the willful or unwitting acts of forgetting. Sometimes the omissions in an autobiography are as revealing as the inclusions.
And then completely different, the government records, those police reports we talked about.
Essential for getting the view from the other side, the colonial state's perspective. These secret reports show how the authorities tracked the movement, how they perceived the leaders, what they feared.
But as we saw with the Salt March, they weren't always accurate or objective.
Far from it. They were filtered up through the bureaucracy, often reflecting what senior officials wanted to believe or wanted London to believe. We saw that clear contradiction between their initial dismissal of the Salt March and the evidence of its growing strength contained in the very same reports.
That gap reveals their own fears, their anxieties, their struggle to understand a movement that didn't fit their usual categories of resistance.
Mm.
They were watching constantly, assessing threats, and that colored their reporting.
And finally, you have contemporary newspapers.
In English, in Indian languages, tracking events reflecting public opinion.
But again, with caveats. Newspapers were rarely neutral. They had editorial lines, political biases. A London paper reported things very differently from an Indian nationalist paper. You have to read them critically, understand their perspective. Sometimes, as the source notes, newspapers might even reflect official anxieties or be used by officials to leak information or shape opinion. You can't just take everything at face value.
So it's really about piecing together this mosaic. Gandhi's words, private letters, autobiographical accounts, the view from the police files, the buzz in the newspapers, even the popular rumors and myths. All these different angles give us a richer, more complex picture.
Exactly. History isn't one simple story. Every source has its angle, its limits. But by reading them together, comparing them, questioning them, looking for patterns and contradictions, we get closer to understanding the intricate reality of this incredibly important time and the extraordinary man at its center.
Yeah.
And, that skill of weighing different sources, different perspectives, it's not just for historians. It's crucial for making sense of anything complex in the world today.
Absolutely. So wrapping up this deep dive, we've tracked Gandhi's journey returning to India, becoming leader of a mass movement, developing unique methods like Satyagraha, and using powerful symbols. We've seen his deep connection with ordinary people, even sparking myths.
We looked at the big campaigns, non-cooperation, Salt Satyagraha, Quit India, and how people on the ground interpreted and acted on those calls. And we touched on the huge challenges: internal Congress divisions, the fundamental debate with Ambedkar, the struggle for Hindu-Muslim unity, ending in the tragedy of partition, and his final heroic efforts for peace.
Understanding this period, it's not just history, is it? It's about understanding the roots of modern India, the complexities of social change, the challenges of leadership in a diverse society.
And as you reflect on this story, the birth of a nation, this incredibly complex figure at its heart, seen as a saint by some, a politician by others, a mediator wrestling with immense forces, maybe consider this. What does it really take for one person to shape history on such a scale? And how does the history they live through inevitably shape them in return?